Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's Civil War time. Oh my goodness gracious me. A little bit of dating advice. Never date a white guy who's obsessed with the Civil War. Um, that's probably not a great way to start a video now I think about it. Okay, whatever, who cares? I don't even care. I don't even care. Who are you? Anyway, so yes, this is going to be our 17th chapter right here. We're going to talk about the Civil War. Now, you might have learned about the Civil War in the past. You might have heard about some battles in the past. Honestly, there aren't that many things you need to know about the Civil War, all things considered. Sounded like Marge Simpson there for a second. Obviously, there are some important developments that happened militarily during the Civil War, but the big thing to focus on is sort of the effects and how the war was conducted, especially as it relates to slavery. Now, slavery, arguably, if you take an irreconcilable approach on things, is the cause of the Civil War. However, the North didn't really see it that way, at least at the beginning. We do see that kind of there is this general insistence by the Union military and the Union government to really not address the issue of slavery until it has to. And that's what we're going to really explore in this chapter right here. Now, again, as always, we're going to set a timer for 20 minutes. All right. Now, let's go ahead and get started. But before we do, AP lesson topics. There's really two. It's government policies during the Civil War and the military side of things. Now, let's go ahead and see the beginning. Three, two, one, and go. All right. Now, the Civil War is obviously going to be this conflict between the North, the Union, and the South, the Confederate States of America. Now, there's things that are much more complicated, but we don't really have time to go into them all that much. Now, what actually starts the Civil War? As you might recall from our previous chapter, the Civil War did not necessarily begin with Lincoln's election. Lincoln's election did lead to the secession of several Southern states. Oh, that's great alliteration right there. So, several Southern states secede from the Union after Lincoln's election. However, we don't really see a military conflict just yet. The Union, the North, the federal government under Lincoln, it does not recognize the independence of the South. However, there is going to be some things that do set us up for a eventual conflict. For example, we do see that some peaceful attempts to end the secession crisis are actually going to be rejected by Abraham Lincoln. For one thing, Lincoln is going to reject what is known as the Crittenden Compromise. Now, what the heck was the Crittenden Compromise? In 1860, John C. Crittenden, who was a representative, a member of Congress from Kentucky, he offered a solution to try and restore Southern states back into the Union and prevent a potential conflict. Now, this Crittenden Compromise was a proposed amendment which would do two things: promise to never abolish slavery, and two, extend the 3630 line from the Missouri Compromise from the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, even though this is an attempt to lure these southern states back into the Union, an attempt to kind of say, guys, we are not worried that we don't want slavery to be abolished. So, you guys don't want slavery to be abolished. We promise not to abolish slavery. Now, Lincoln rejects this. He rejects the Crittenden Compromise, again, because Lincoln firmly believes the best way to kill off slavery is to prevent its spread. Lincoln believed that slavery was bad, but he didn't believe in immediate emancipation. He didn't believe in abolition, and he even toyed with the idea of sending African Americans elsewhere, outside of North America, outside of the United States in general. However, all of that being said, Lincoln did firmly believe that if slavery was allowed to spread, and it could under the Crittenden Compromise, we do see that Lincoln rejects it. And kind of with Lincoln's rejection of this attempt to bring the South back peacefully, it only is a matter of time before violence breaks out. Now, when does that violence break out? It breaks out in April of 1861. Lincoln takes the oath of office in March of 61. The war actually begins in April of 61. Basically, the southern states, there was a lot of federal fortresses still in the South, including this one in Charleston called Fort Sumter. When Lincoln refuses to give up Fort Sumter, and when he begins peacefully resupplying the island fortress, the South responds by blowing up Fort Sumter. Now, this is going to cause Lincoln to declare the South in a state of rebellion, and in order to restore federal control of these southern states, that's going to be the Civil War right there. Now, the Civil War is going to be extremely bloody, and we'll take a look at how it develops politically mostly. But in terms of military sort of things, let's take a look at that. Well, the Civil War is notable in world and indeed American history in that it is one of the first industrial wars. It is fought using modern industrial military technology, and it is going to lead to extremely high casualty rates. About 3% of Americans die as a result of the Civil War. That doesn't sound like that many, but in terms of kind of the effect that the loss of 3% of the population has and the wounding of millions more, that is going to lead to huge kind of mental and physical scars in this country. Entire towns are burned down. It's a very destructive war, even if it doesn't sound like the death rate is all that high. Now, what made this war so bloody? Bloody, bloody Civil War. Why do I call it Civil War? It doesn't tend to be all that civil. I'm here all week. Anyway, now, what's the kind of difference here? What happened? So, changes in military technology are largely what account for the mass devastation of lives in the Civil War. We do see the development of new military technology, such as the Gatling gun, such as ironclads. The use of railroads allows for thousands of troops to be moved around very quickly, very rapidly, and oftentimes very rapidly to their deaths. We do see a lot of horrific casualties in the form of new bullets that are designed. The Minet ball, for one thing, grooved rifled barrels as well for guns. That allows for greater accuracy. It allows for extremely high casualty rates. We also see a lot of amputations as a result of the Civil War. So it's very horrific. I should also note that this is the first war in which we largely see the use of photography, which is much more widely used. Photography existed beforehand, but it's much more widely available during the Civil War. Sorry, here we go. Now, in terms of kind of the military side of things, what advantages did the Union have? What disadvantages did they have? What advantages did the Confederates have? What disadvantages did they have? Now, in terms of advantages for the Union, obviously the big things they got going for them is industry, is manpower, and to give Lincoln some credit, good political leadership. Lincoln, as we're going to talk about more in our next slide, actually, Lincoln is going to use the kind of most of his presidential power to establish the Union on a good course for winning this war. Lincoln's going to use the federal government effectively, even if his actions aren't going to always be popular. We'll talk about that more in a second. But in terms of manpower and industry, the North already having this burgeoning industrial economy, they have it's definitely much more people thanks to the arrival of immigrants from Europe, especially from Ireland and Germany, and kind of using all of these things. It's inevitable the Union's going to win. However, what slows that inevitable victory by the Union? Because we do see that the war is unpopular in the North. There's kind of fear and accusation. This war is about making African Americans equal citizens in this country, abolishing slavery. And many white Northerners, even though they don't like slavery, they don't want the end of slavery. They don't want African Americans competing for white labor. We also see as well there's unpopular actions such as the suspension of habeas corpus. We'll talk about that more in a second. We see the Conscription Act. All men have to serve in the Union military or are potentially could serve in the Union military. But we also see, especially in the early years of the Civil War, very poor military leadership. Leaders that didn't take advantage of the South's relative disorganization and could have pressed the thing to actually win the war much more quickly. And we'll take a look at how that changes later. But we see that kind of in the early years, the Union had a lot of disadvantage in militarily. We had bad generals like George B. McClellan, the imbecile that he was, who didn't really use the strength of the Union military effectively enough and allowed the Confederacy to, in a way, dig in, especially defending their capital of Richmond in Virginia. Now, we've got these kneecaps to Union potential success, but we also have some advantages for the Confederacy. The single biggest advantage is that the South, especially, or I should say the Confederacy, had a strong military tradition, aka they had a lot of competent military leaders. For example, we have figures like Robert E. Lee. We have Stonewall, or Thomas Stonewall Jackson. We've got Longstreet, I guess, was cool. Longstreet's my favorite Confederate general because he joins the Republican Party during Reconstruction, but that's a different thing. And a lot of Southerners hated him. And generally, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But whatever. Uh, if this ever gets out that I hate the South, never mind. Anyway, so good military leadership, or at least capable and effective military leadership, being able to use what limited resources the Confederacy had, but also the South had the possibility of foreign support, especially in the early years of the Civil War. Before 1863, it was a very realistic possibility that the South could have been supported by foreign powers like the British and the French. Both of these powers were power hungry, or economically hungry for cotton from the South. They were textile producers. However, the Confederacy had a lot of disadvantages. For one thing, the war was equally unpopular in the South. There's a lot of accusations that this is a war to defend slavery, because it was a war to defend slavery. And a lot of poor white Southerners, even if they were against equality between African Americans and white people, they viewed it as a war to defend, well, rich white people, rich slave owners. On top of that, we also see there's a lack of industry, but there's also a lack of political organization. Lincoln, to give him a lot of credit, effectively used the weight of the federal government to conduct the Civil War. That same power didn't exist in the South, especially under Jefferson Davis. Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and honestly, he was a stupid president. Well, he was kind of already kneecapped because of the strong focus on states' rights in the South. So, Jefferson Davis's inability to organize politically, that was one of the big symbols of defeat, eventual defeat for the Southern Confederacy. All right. So in this slide, we kind of summed up what the causes of the Civil War are, at least in the short term, kind of the firing at Fort Sumter. We talked about the military side of things. We talked about the advantages and the disadvantages. Now, how does this war actually carry out? Well, first, let's take a look at the early years of the Civil War. The early years of the Civil War, it's not guaranteed a Union victory. And in fact, it very much seems like the Confederacy, it could maintain its independence. So, what is kind of the big picture thing going on during this time? For one thing, it's not going to be an easy Union victory. So, what does Lincoln, the president, have to deal with? Well, Lincoln is really concerned about restoring the Union. That is his primary goal. That's especially what he says to the public. I'm in favor of restoring the Union. What I do to help this country. So, in order to kind of maintain Lincoln's control over what areas he still possesses, we do see that Lincoln has to deal with especially these areas known as the border states. Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. Now, these states had slavery, but Lincoln is going to toe a fine line of trying to keep these states in the Union while also not really interfering with slavery in those places. Now, in order to accomplish kind of national unity, this is when we see the expansion of presidential authority. That's kind of the big or at least one of the big constitutional things about the Civil War, is that really it's the first military crisis in which a president utilizes what we call wartime powers. He uses powers with the intent of preserving a strong federal government in opposition to a rebelling faction of, well, in this case, slave owners. Now, some examples of this include the suspension of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the right to be accused of a crime
before being arrested. You are arrested on the charge of uh, being such a cute little kitty. That's you, Mr. Claude. Anyway, so that's the that's a constitutional right. That's in the Bill of Rights. It's sort of this idea of due process in the Fifth Amendment. Lincoln suspends a lot of basic civil liberties, especially in these border states, namely in Maryland. Now, there's also the Conscription Act, and there's also kind of the federal government's adoption of the American system, actually. The American system, proposed by Henry Clay, our good friend from Unit 3, he is going to kind of have his dreams come true with the Civil War. Not the South always voting down Northern proposals for the American system. The North actually adopts all these things, especially federal support for railroad development. You'll learn about this more in Unit 6, but the kind of Civil War does lay the groundwork. It lays the track, if you will, for future economic developments in this country, namely the expansion of industry. And we'll take a look at that more in Unit 6. All right. So, federal government is using the weight of its power to both establish national unity, even if that means suspending constitutional liberties, but it also means economic centralization. We see the adoption of greenbacks, so a centralized currency. We see the adoption of infrastructure support, namely with railroads, and we also see a tariff system as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that Lincoln is going to do anything to win this war, and he really wants to win this war by hurting the South economically and also alienating the Confederacy from potential foreign backers. And it's in this context of Lincoln being a pragmatist, of doing whatever it takes to end this war. This is where we have to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation does not free every single slave in the United States. That's the 13th Amendment. But what the Emancipation Proclamation does is essentially Lincoln is going to say that all of the slaves in rebelling areas, the federal government will recognize as free and will begin freeing those slaves upon January 1st, 1863. Now, again, look at this map on the bottom right here. All of the red areas are not under Union control. All of the blue areas are under Union control. But what Lincoln's going to say is, guys in the light blue areas, I'm not going to touch slavery. You guys can keep your slaves. Guys in the red, if you don't come back to the Union, I'm going to recognize your slaves as free. You rebels, I'm confiscating your property. You want to think of slaves as property, then go ahead. I will confiscate that property to punish you for rebellion against the Union. Now, the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation is not going to be the immediate abolition of slavery, but it does kind of change the goal of the Civil War. The Union now kind of adds to this promise of when it begins liberating the South, of restoring federal control there. We see that slaves are going to be regarded as free. They're going to be literally emancipated, granted their freedom. Now, this kind of war goal of ending slavery, it is going to alienate the Confederacy from potential foreign backers. The French and the British are going to say, whoa, 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 we can't back the problematic South. They're a bunch of racists. We don't want to look racist. Let's not back the South. The South is canceled because of the Emancipation Proclamation. However, more importantly, I guess, is that the Emancipation Proclamation also opens the doors for African American military involvement. Now, you don't really need to know this for our Unit 5 test, but Black involvement in the Civil War, it comes through obviously political agitation to kind of pressure Lincoln to adopt this Emancipation Proclamation, but also comes in the form of soldiers themselves. African American men served as soldiers. Something like 40%, I believe, of African American men served as soldiers in the Union military during the Civil War. Now, the kind of use of black soldiers, that's going to be a necessary boost against the Confederacy. All right. Now, how does the war end? Now, the real turning point of the war is going to literally be with these two battles right here, Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Union victory at both of these battles, Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, Vicksburg along the Mississippi River. This is going to kind of signal the end of Southern kind of resistance against the Union. And it kind of a slow process of pushing back the South and forcing them to retreat, eventually going to be forcing them to surrender. Now, these two battles right here kind of signaled the beginning of change because of the fact that Lincoln is now going to replace a lot of the ineffective military leadership with much more effective Union generals. Probably the two most important are Ulysses S. Grant, the handsome, dapper man on the screen right there, and also William Tecumseh Sherman. Both Grant and Sherman are going to be effective military leaders. They realize that they can't let the South regain anything that it loses in battles. So there is going to be eventually kind of more aggressive tactics. Kind of Grant and Sherman throw everything the Unions got against the Confederacy. And kind of this is going to wear down the South's ability to wage war. Grant has a lot of men that he can easily replace. The Union has a lot of manpower. The Confederacy doesn't have a lot of things to replace its men. It's not going to free slaves and give them guns. Well, eventually they do consider that, but that's a little too late, and they don't give them guns. But the other thing is that uh, kind of the South can't replace anything that it loses. The North can. And Grant realizes this. He throws wave after wave of his own men, making him sound like a butcher. Grant was kind of a cool and good dude. Well, yeah, but whatever. Okay. Yeah. So there is this kind of more aggressive military campaign against the South. Eventually, the South has to realize it cannot win. They eventually surrender. The last major battle of the Civil War is the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. After kind of the Confederacy lose this, Lee, the general for the South, one of the generals for the South, he's eventually going to say, you know what, enough's enough. I'm going to lay down my arms. Guys, go home. The war is over. And just like that, the war is over. We tend to our wounded. We count our dead. Black and white soldiers wondering like if this really means freedom. Yo, guess what? 13th mother freaking amendment. All right, now let's
I got a little distracted with my colorful commentary here. But anyway, let's talk about the results of the Civil War. Well, economically, the result of the Civil War is industrialization. Wars in history generally lead to greater industrial output because you need guns to wage the war. So you need more factories to make more guns. And then in order to make more factories, you need steel plants, you need railroads, etc. So there is a boom of industry, something that is going to definitely continue after the Civil War, especially in the North. Now, economic expansion, the federal government is largely assisting in this. Railroad acts like the Pacific Railway Act, which gave away millions of acres of free land to railroad companies, I should say. There's patents that are established by the federal government. Generally, economic expansion because of this war. It's very similar to what we're going to see in World War I and in World War II. Now, Lincoln is also going to kind of effectively change the power of the federal government. The federal government grows in its power. We do see that there is a greater importance of the national government over local state governments. There's going to be some changes and exceptions to what I'm saying here, but generally, Americans kind of view themselves less as people from their individual states and more as collectively Americans. We also see that the Civil War disproved the theory that states were in the Union voluntarily. No, they're in it for the long run. It is a perpetual union. You see, before the Civil War, theories like nullification, theories like independence for state governments largely were accepted and adopted. Now, state governments after the Civil War still have local autonomy, don't get me wrong, but that kind of system of federalism is going to weigh more in favor of the national government thanks to the Civil War. And kind of we saw that because of Lincoln's wartime powers, habeas corpus, First Amendment, emancipation. All of these things represent a strong federal government. But we also do see the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment is eventually ratified by or approved by Congress in 1865. The Civil War is going to basically confirm the end of slavery. Most Northerners support the abolition of slavery everywhere because Americans kind of get this real patriotic sense of liberty and freedom. Those are Union values. With the little info, the clip art that I have right here, it makes it seem like the railroad conductors were the ones liberated from slavery, but that's not true. All right. Anyway, that's it. Thank you guys so much. The war is over. I sure hope that the results of it are going to lead to complete equality for all people in the United States. And hopefully that lasts forever. It's not. Reconstruction's terrible. All right. In the sense that it failed, not in the sense that it was attempted. Wonderful that it was attempted. The South needed to be like a phoenix, kind of remolded, burned down, remolded, and shaped into a clay pot of freedom. And yet that clay pot is broken. All right. Uh God bless America. All right. See you next chapter, a decidedly more depressing chapter. Bye bye. Let us Where's the thing? Zip zap zippity zoop zooza. There it is. All right. Bye bye. Have a great day. Pause and